facilitate an on-campus small group that's going to meet on Sunday, October the 15th. So if that's you, you've got the right video and you're in the right spot, and hopefully some of these things we'll talk about in the next few minutes will be of help to you. Hey, as usual, let me just encourage you to go ahead, if you haven't already, print out the manuscript of the lesson. And if you haven't had a chance to read through that, I would say pause the video right now. Go ahead and read through the lesson, because that'll help you think through what we're going to talk about here. Get that in front of you. You may want to have something to take some notes on and that type of thing there. What we're going to do is just take a few minutes, kind of give some overview of what we're going to be talking about, make a few comments here, and hopefully be some encouragement to you. And as I said, some help for you in preparing. This message is going to be complementary to what Brett will be teaching in the main room on Sunday morning. By the way, there is a reference era on the lesson. This is the lesson, Brett's message is going to come out of Acts chapter 6 and 7. We're going to be talking about Stephen. And if you remember the story of Stephen, he was one of those first guys that surfaced up in the church to serve the people of the church. Some people say in Acts chapter 6 helps us understand what deacon ministry is, and maybe those were the very first deacons. We're really not sure about that, but they definitely carried out deacon kind of ministry. And then Stephen was also, as far as we recorded for us in the New Testament, he was the first Christian martyr, one that was lost his life. He gave up his life for his faith in Jesus. And so we're going to be looking at that passage in our teaching time in the main room. And then what we're going to be focusing in on our small groups, we're going to be focusing on something I think that's very vital in this and understanding as we look at the life of Stephen and see how God used, especially something so tragic, so horrible, the death of one of his beloved. He used that to help continue the gospel ministry and to grow the gospel ministry. And what this boils down for us is, in Stephen's case, we see this exemplified, is how did Stephen face such a difficult situation? How did he have, as we'll see in our the message that will be shared, faced in such a pressure, stress-filled environment? How did he deal with that, and how did he deal with, we're going to see very calmly and very courageously, how was he able to do that? And it boils down to this one thing, that Stephen had come to a place in his life where he trusted God ultimately. He trusted God completely. He trusted God without any reservation. And kind of back to go back to the story of Daniel and his three friends there when they were in captivity, and how they were called into question for their faith, and you remember the story there where they would not bow and worship the idol of the king, and basically they said, look, you can do to us whatever you want to, and you can throw us into this fiery furnace and whatever, and if we die, we die. If we live, we live. But the bottom line is, we know who God is, and we're trusting Him. And we see the same thing here in the life of Stephen, and that's what we're going to focus in on our small group time. We're going to talk about trusting God. We're going to be looking at two different passages. We're going to look at a couple of verses from Psalm 56, which is out of the life of David, and records for us an event that happened in the life of David, how he trusted God in that. And then we're going to be looking in Matthew chapter 14, that is probably a familiar passage to many of us, chapter 20, verse 22 through 33. And this records the time where Jesus had sent his disciples ahead over the Sea of Galilee. They were going by boat, rowing across the waters. A storm came up, overtook them. A very fearful, frightening situation. And the circumstances were not good. And they became afraid for their lives in a sense, unsure of what was going to happen to them. Jesus shows up walking on the water. And there's some interaction that happens there because they don't recognize who he is to begin with. Peter kind of calls out, says, hey, if you are Jesus, let me come to you. And Jesus says, come on, Peter. Peter steps out of the boat, begins to walk on the water, just as Jesus was. Takes his eyes off of Jesus, becomes overwhelmed by a situation, begins to sink and cries out, Lord, save me. And Jesus rescues him. And the end result of that was that Jesus said to them, and to Peter, he kind of chastised Peter a little bit and chided him for not believing, trusting him more, but did not chastise him for the faith that he exercised. So we're going to be looking at those two passages there. And here, that means we get ready to start on that. Let me just give you some things to think about in that regard. The big idea that we're looking at is basically how do we trust God, or what does it mean to trust God? And as you'll see there on page 1 in the overview, the trusting God means that we're going to put our faith and trust in Him even when it doesn't really make sense from an earthly perspective. And the reason we're going to do that is not based on us or based on what our circumstances are. The reason we can trust God is because of who He is, His own personal character, and what He has said in His Word, the promises that He's given us. And so that's what we're going to be looking at, and the fact that God is worthy of our trust there. Now, you've got the overview, the big idea, they got the introduction. You get into unpacking the biblical text, and we're going to be looking, as I said, at those two passages there out of Psalm 56, verse 3 and 4, and Matthew chapter 14, 22 through 33. The first passage, Psalm 56, is we're basically looking at how David in his situation, what was it that caused him to be able to say with such confidence, I'm trusting God? And you'll see it comes from two things. One, he understood the character of God, and number two, he trusted in the Word of God, that God would do what He said He will do. And so those are two important things to hang on to as you're preparing and working through this. A suggestion for you is on page 4. We give several different scripture verses there that help us understand about the character of God, because if we don't understand who God is, it's going to be very difficult to trust Him. And so the way we understand about who God is by reading and studying our Bibles. That's why we make the suggestion, teaching tip there, encourages you to drive home that point that, hey, folks, we've got to be reading and studying our Bibles. Our faith is not going to be very strong if we don't, because we're not going to understand who God is or what He has promised us in His Word, because our faith comes from that, and our faith is built upon that. And in these passages here, there are several of them there, and I would encourage you to take a moment. If you're use the whiteboard, this is a great time to do that. If not, just maybe pass these out to have these on some cards or pieces of paper where you can give to different folks, let them read these verses, and as you do, surface up what it says there about who God is. And take us some time to think that through as a group about how, when we understand this characteristic, this quality, this attribute of God, that's going to help us grow in our faith and help our faith get stronger. And think that through with them there in that way there. Now, the second aspect of this is the story, of course, with Peter walking on the water and with the disciples going across the Sea of Galilee. That second teaching point says we learn to trust God by being put in a position where we must trust Him. And in a sense, that's what Jesus did. He put those disciples in that situation. Jesus knew that this storm was going to come. None of that took Him by surprise. He had intentionally put those disciples in that particular situation. And why did He do that? It was a test in many ways, but it was not a test that was designed for them to fail. God doesn't put us in tests, so to speak, so we can flunk out. He puts us in those situations to help us grow and develop in our relationship with Him. And that was the whole purpose of what was happening here. They had just witnessed a great miracle, and Jesus was wanting to drive home the point with them that He is trustworthy. They've seen who He is. They'd seen Him in carrying out this unbelievable miracle of the feeding of these thousands of people. They wanted to drive home the point. Jesus wanted to drive home the point to them that He can be trusted because of who He is, that He is the King. He's the King of all kings. And so that's what we're looking at there. Now, understand that in that test and in the test of life where we find ourselves, it is when the pressure rises, when the situation and circumstances are not very favorable, that's when the quality of our faith or the character of our faith surface up. But if we do not understand who God is and we do not know the promises of God to hang on to, it is going to cause some challenges for our faith. Again, those are the two things that are so significant for us as we work through this lesson and think that through. Now, there's a lot of good stuff there in that story with Peter and the disciples and Peter going across the Sea of Galilee and Jesus coming to them. And you may be tempted a little bit to get caught up in the details of that, and obviously you want to use those details. But let me encourage you to do this. Don't get so focused on the details of that story that you miss the whole point of what this is about, and that is that Jesus wants to encourage them, strengthen them, help them grow in their faith, and learn to trust Him even when it doesn't make sense from an earthly perspective. Hey, have a great time with your group this Sunday. And also don't forget to use the application moment. You've got your handout there that you're familiar with that. Have some discussion questions. So take advantage of that. Use that and have a great time studying, a great time of growing in your faith, and a time of your small group learning to trust God because of who He is and what He has said in His Word. Promises.